The man known to history as Josef Mengele was born on the 16th of March 1911 in the town of Günzburg in southern Germany. His father was Karl Mengele, an engineer who around about the time of Josef's birth had become the proprietor of a foundry which manufactured farming equipment for various purposes such as sawing, cutting, and milling. There were 7 men on the payroll of the company in the early 1910s, which meant that the Mengeles were one of the more affluent families in the Günzburg area. Josef's mother was Walburga Hopfauer, who would subsequently give birth to Josef's 2 younger brothers, Karl Jr. and Alois. The young Josef grew up in a world which was in the depths of total war. It was only in the recent past that Germany had become a country at all. As recently as the 1860s, its territory was divided between over 24 smaller states. However, in 1871, these united under Prussian leadership to form the German Empire. This severely disrupted the balance of power in Europe, and in the decades that followed, the continent drifted towards war. Germany formed an alliance with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, while Britain, France, and Russia allied to offset the rise of Germany. At first, these powers confined their disputes to proxy conflicts in Africa and the Balkans. But in the summer of 1914, a regional dispute in the Balkans led to the outbreak of a general European war. It soon expanded to bring in countries such as Japan. And so the First World War had commenced. It lasted for over 4 years, with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire fighting Britain, France, Russia, and Italy, with the United States later joining on their side. The defeat of Germany brought the empire to an end, and a new German republic was created, named after the town of Weimar. More importantly, a series of punitive peace terms were imposed on Germany under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and these would have lasting repercussions. The infant Mengele might not have been entirely unaware of these developments, as they had impacted substantially on the Mengele household. Karl left to fight in the German army shortly after the conflict began, and Walburga was left to raise the children and attempt to keep the business ticking over during the war. She did this with a steely determination and successfully negotiated a contract with the German government to produce a type of army vehicle for use on the war front, known as the Faragewagen. As a result, the company prospered, and when Karl Mengele returned to Günzburg at the end of the war, he was able to keep the company moving forward. By the early 1920s, it had become the 3rd largest producer of threshing machinery in the whole of Germany. Extended family members were called upon to aid in the building up of the organization, and as a result, the Mengele name is very common in the Günzburg area to this day, and Karl Mengele Straße is one of the main streets in the town. A curious contrast between the civic significance of the wider Mengele family and the appalling crimes which Karl and Walburga Mengele's eldest son would commit. More immediately, what this prosperity meant for Josef in the 1920s was that he had the financial backing to engage in extensive studies. Mengele was a relatively successful student in his teenage years. He excelled at art and developed wide interests in music and in physical activity. He appears to have favored skiing, the town being not too far from the northern end of the German Alps. In April of 1930, Josef Mengele passed his high school exams with a decent, but hardly exceptional grade. Initially, he seems to have considered becoming a dentist, having noted that there was not one dentist in the local area, and that this would be a promising trade to practice. However, he subsequently decided that this was too specialized, and opted for medicine, with an emphasis on anthropology and genetics. He was clearly ambitious, and his correspondence from this time indicates an individual who wanted to impress his family by becoming its first medical scientist. And so it was that in October 1930, he left the family home and headed east to the city of Munich, the capital of Bavaria. Here he enrolled in both the medicine and philosophy departments, indicating an interest in both the hard science element of medicine and broader speculation and inquiry. It was a mix of interests which would later have terrifying results. Mengele arrived in Bavaria just as a new political party was emerging in the area and was beginning its ascent to power. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, had been founded a decade earlier and had quickly come under the control of an Austrian firebrand called Adolf Hitler. In November 1923, this collection of disaffected war veterans whose main concern was to prevent the rise of leftist parties such as the Communists, and to redress the overly punitive terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end, had attempted a coup in Munich, but it was quickly suppressed. Thereafter, they turned to constitutional politics to achieve their ends, but initially floundered at the polls until the autumn of 1929, when, after a decade of rampant growth, the Wall Street Stock Exchange suffered catastrophic losses, and the world's economy went into a tailspin. As individuals lost their jobs and life savings throughout Germany, parties such as the Nazis and the Communists began to experience a surge of support in elections. As the Great Depression, which followed the Wall Street crash, dragged on through the early 1930s, Hitler and his associates would become ever more popular with their message of xenophobia and resentment at Germany's position in the world. Mengele was soon involved in the political torrents which were raging around him. Although he would not become a member of the Nazi Party itself for some time yet, in March 1931 he joined the Stahlhelms, an ex-servicemen's organization which was named after the helmets worn by the German army during the First World War. The Stahlhelms marched regularly and held military-style rallies, but the Nazis also had an early appeal to the young Josef. In his autobiography written years later, Mengele noted that the students of the university, those who had already reached the voting age, had contributed to this Nazi success. I was not then old enough to vote. My political leanings then were, I think for reasons of family tradition, national conservative. I had not joined any political organization, though indeed I was strongly attracted by the program and the whole organization of the National Socialists. That, for the time being, I remained an unorganized private person. But in the long run, it was impossible to stand aside in these politically stirring times. Should our fatherland not succumb to the Marxist Bolshevik attack? This simple political concept finally became the decisive factor in my life. From this, it appears that it was only a matter of time before Mengele joined the Nazis. Mengele's early years in Munich witnessed the full rise of the Nazis. By 1932, Hitler and his associates were the largest party in Germany, and their support translated into 40% of the national vote in the Reichstag elections, which were held that year. This was still not enough to form a majority government, and Germany's politics floundered in the second half of 1932. At stake was whether the country would lean towards the Nazis or towards the Communists, the second largest political group in Germany by this time. Whichever was to seize power would probably spell the end of the Weimar Republic. Then, late in 1932 and into early 1933, the political and business establishment made a Faustian bargain with Hitler and the Nazis, agreeing to bring Hitler and several of his senior colleagues into the government, in the misguided belief that they would be able to control him and his party. It was a fatal underestimation, and having allowed Hitler in, the Nazis quickly set about seizing absolute power. A political emergency was concocted to warrant the passage of an enabling act, which effectively allowed Hitler as Chancellor to rule by decree. Thus, in the course of just a few short months in the first half of 1933, the Nazis seized absolute power throughout Germany and established a one-party state, one which would hold power for the next 12 years. By 1934, Mengele was increasingly preoccupied by his studies, although many of his contemporaries subsequently recorded that they never regarded him as being a particularly accomplished student. Many, however, would note that he made up for his lack of pronounced intellect with ambition and hard work. His ambition had driven Mengele to simultaneously study for a doctorate and act as a practicing medic during the mid-1930s. It was during this time that the Stahlhelms, which Mengele had been a member of for some time, were merged with the Sturmabteilung, or Brown Shirts, the Nazi Party's original paramilitary wing. Hitler had ordered the merger, distrusting the Stahlhelms' fundamentally monarchist nature. A serious kidney complaint forced Mengele to end his association with the organization, leaving him more time for his studies. Overall, his studies did result in academic rewards. In 1935, Mengele was awarded a PhD for a thesis entitled Racial Morphological Research on the Lower Jaw Section of 4 Racial Groups. Here, Mengele argued that it was possible to determine the race of an individual by examining their jaw alone. However, it should be noted that at this time Mengele's findings were based on scientific principles, and there was no overt racist or anti-Semitic sentiments expressed in the thesis. This is significant, for it suggests Mengele had not been radicalized to the extent he later would be. Having finished his thesis and acquired his doctorate, Mengele briefly spent a few months working as a junior resident doctor, a compulsory service which was required for him to obtain a full medical license. It was during this time, while working in a hospital in Leipzig, that he first met Irene Schönbein, whom he would subsequently marry in 1939. Their only son, Rolf, would be born in 1944. However, while his personal life had prospered, Mengele was not suited to the work of a resident doctor, with its long hours and ward rounds, and he was eager to resume his studies. To that end, he sought and obtained a position as a research assistant at the Third Reich Institute for Heredity, Biology, and Racial Purity at the University of Frankfurt in January 1937. Here he would study under Professor Ottmar Freiherr von Fauschur, an admirer of Hitler's, and an individual who professed to be an expert on the ominously titled concept of race hygiene. It is to this period in his life that Mengele's more deplorable views and the corruption of his character can surely be traced. Until this point, while he had exhibited an interest in race and genetics, his earlier thesis was not overtly racist. In Frankfurt, he became steeped in Nazi racial ideology, and in May 1937, he finally applied to join the Nazi Party and was soon accepted as member 5,574,974. In the course of the late 1930s, Mengele worked closely with von Fauschur, often authoring reports for courts which the Nazi state was convening to judge German Jewish people who were deemed to have violated the Nuremberg laws, a series of oppressive measures which had been introduced during the mid-1930s to disenfranchise the Jewish population of the country. This involved rather perverse medical evidence. For instance, defendants were often brought before the court to decide whether or not they actually had Jewish blood, and so would consequently have breached one of the Nuremberg laws. In some of these instances, Mengele and von Fauschur would conduct physical examinations of the defendant, measuring his or her nose and other features in order to determine if the defendant did in fact have Jewish ancestry. There is a definite shift here from Mengele. In Munich, he had used legitimate scientific methods in his research and produced work which historians and other scholars have generally agreed was unproblematic, even by modern standards. However, in Frankfurt in the late 1930s, there was a descent into unscientific racial theories based around Nazi ideology. Clearly, his time at Frankfurt had brought on a significant change of character. Whatever the nuances of his actual work, Mengele's role in Frankfurt was allowing him to progress rapidly in his career. Mengele was promoted by von Fauschur to become one of his assistant physicians, after Mengele had been awarded his full medical degree from Frankfurt in 1938. It is from this time that Mengele first began to discuss the concept of individuals and races being improved. through appropriate selection, a clear indication that he was fully involved in the Nazis' racial ideology by this time. And politically, he was becoming more and more mired in the regime. Several months after becoming a member of the Nazi Party, he applied for membership of the SS or Schutzstaffel, one of the paramilitary wings of the Nazi regime, headed by Heinrich Himmler, and the one which would soon be placed in charge of a network of concentration camps which proliferated across Central and Eastern Europe. He would subsequently join the Waffen-SS, an elite subgroup of the SS, while his professional work and political life were bleeding into each other as well, as he joined the Third Reich Institute and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, both institutions being to the fore of the study of eugenics in Germany, and, as a result, effectively mouthpieces for pseudo-scientific Nazi racial ideology. As Mengele's studies were continuing through the 1930s, the Nazis were pushing Europe towards war. It had always been the stated aim of Hitler and his associates to overturn the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and reassert Germany's place as a European power. While the first years after the Nazi seizure of power in 1933 did not see an overt effort to do so, from 1936, this aggression rapidly escalated. In the spring of that year, the German army moved into the Rhineland, remilitarizing a part of the country which had been expressly forbidden under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Then in 1938, Austria was effectively annexed into a Greater Germany, and further annexations quickly followed. First, the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia in the autumn of 1938, and then, early in 1939, the conquest of Central Europe was effectively completed when Hungary and the rest of Czechoslovakia were turned into puppet regimes. At this stage, Britain and France had signaled that their appeasing of German aggression would not continue any further, particularly if Hitler tried to occupy Poland. And so it was that, when Germany did invade its eastern neighbor on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September. The Second World War had begun. On the eve of the titanic struggle which would soon engulf the European continent, Mengele's career had run into its first and only significant impediment under the Nazis. In the summer of 1939, he planned to marry Irena after several years of courtship, but there was controversy in the run-up to the wedding, with some querying whether his wife-to-be had some traces of Jewish blood. Mengele enlisted the help of some well-connected colleagues and friends who assured the panel which adjudicated on these matters that Irena had very Nordic ways, and yet a search through records for the extended family as far away as the United States could not entirely resolve the matter. Consequently, while Josef was unable to comprehensively prove that he was not marrying a woman who had a small amount of Jewish blood, he was nevertheless able to sweep the question aside without having fully answered it. There is a dark irony here, as the man who would soon be deciding upon people's lives based on racial purity was prohibited from being issued a certificate himself by the Nazi regime that would declare his own children to be of pure Aryan blood. Mengele was pleased when the war broke out. His son Rolf would state many years later that his father had told him that he viewed the war as a necessary struggle to reassert the German nation after years of being trammeled and downtrodden following the First World War. Mengele had enlisted straight away. However, his old kidney ailment returned in late 1939 and made it impossible for him to enter service until the summer of 1940, by which time the German panzer divisions were conquering Western Europe in a blistering military campaign. Mengele was originally stationed at a military base in Kassel in central Germany. He remained there only for a few weeks before being reassigned to a combat position in his role as a member of the Waffen-SS. As such, he was given an officer's title of Untersturmführer, or a sub-lieutenant. And the next several months were spent in occupied Poland, where Mengele was attached to the genealogical section of the Race and Resettlement Office. the goal of which was to assess the racial purity and thus suitability of individuals who were being chosen to settle as German colonists in Eastern Europe. The idea here was to effectively remove non-Germans from the new Lebensraum, or living space, which was being created in Eastern Europe. While Mengele was serving in Poland, the Nazi state itself was meeting with success in its war effort. The initial invasion of Poland in September 1939 had seen that country quickly overrun and occupied. Thereafter, a phony war of sorts followed through the winter and early spring of 1939 and 1940, as Britain and France tried belatedly to rearm themselves in preparation for a German attack on France. It was slow in coming, and when Hitler did make his move in the spring of 1940, it was to occupy Denmark and Norway. But then, in the early summer, a lightning attack on France saw the north of the country and the Low Countries completely overrun in just a matter of weeks. By the end of the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Worse was to follow, with Benito Mussolini's Italy now joining Hitler's Germany, and a campaign was commenced in North Africa to try to seize Egypt and the Suez Canal from the British. In the summer of 1941, that possibility looked imminent, and other parts of Europe, including the Balkans, had also fallen to the Axis powers of Germany and Italy. Thus, in mid-1941, the war effort looked very bleak indeed for Winston Churchill and his government in London. As the war turned in its favor, Nazi policy began to take on an even darker hue. Confident in the fact that they would soon be masters of Europe and would not have to answer to international pressure from other states, Hitler and the leaders of the Nazi Party began contemplating a more stark approach to their anti-Semitic policies. In 1940 and early 1941, they were considering the idea of forcibly removing millions of Europe's Jews to the East African island of Madagascar, where they would live in a kind of open-air prison. However, when the North Africa campaign stalled and the possibility of seizing the Suez Canal diminished, a much more drastic idea began to develop. This was the final solution: the idea that Europe's Jews would be forcibly rounded up and sent to the patchwork of several dozen concentration camps, which had been created across Central and Eastern Europe since the inception of the war. Here, a small number of the most able-bodied would be used as slave labor in factories to produce German war materials, but most would be killed by exposure to gas within hours of arrival. This approach was ratified at the Wannsee Conference north of Berlin in January 1942, and mass murder was soon occurring at camps such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz. Mengele would soon be posted to the latter. Mengele was to see some military action in 1941. After a protracted period in Poland in mid-1941, he was reassigned to the Eastern Front. Flushed with success in 1940, Hitler had commanded his generals to begin plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, as it became known, would be the largest land invasion ever undertaken by an army. When it commenced that summer, hundreds of thousands of German troops swarmed over the border into the Soviet Union. At first, the invasion met with enormous success, as the Soviet forces melted away and the German Wehrmacht advanced towards Moscow and Leningrad. However, gradually Joseph Stalin and his generals mobilized their troops in an effective fashion. Then, the Russian winter set in. The German army was unprepared for the extreme cold and had not been issued with adequate winter clothing. Consequently, in the course of the winter of 1941, the tide of the war began to shift as the German advance stalled a short distance from Moscow. Mengele served on this front in 1941, specifically in Ukraine, during which action he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. Mengele continued to serve on the Eastern Front even as the war was turning against Germany. In January 1942, he was appointed to the Medical Corps of the Waffen-SS's Viking Division. This crack unit would eventually penetrate further into Russian territory than any other division of the German armed forces. However, Josef was kept away from the front lines. As a medic attached to the division, he was deemed of considerable value and kept back towards the defensive lines, where the unit was performing clearing up operations as opposed to leading at the front. In July, the Viking unit was sent into action around the towns of Rostov and Bataisk in a vicious battle of attrition which lasted for 5 days. During this particular affray, he received the higher version of the Iron Cross, the Iron Cross First Class, as a result of rescuing 2 wounded soldiers from a burning tank while under enemy fire. Having dragged the pair to cover, Mengele had performed first aid on them. He was also awarded the Black Badge for the wounded and the Medal for the care of the German people. Thus it was that Mengele returned back to Poland towards the end of 1942 as a considerably decorated veteran of the Eastern Front. Mengele's return to Poland was probably not a result of mere chance or a reward for his performance in the field of battle. It is more plausible that he owed his recall from the Eastern Front to his old mentor, Professor von Fuscher, who had been appointed as a director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin in early 1942. This institute was charged with overseeing research in the Reich into the concept of racial purity and eugenics, with the decision to enact the final solution and the expansion of the concentration camp system. There was now a limitless supply of individuals who could be studied at the camps as part of this research, and with zero consequences for the researchers as to the methods they employed in their so-called research. Already in the summer of 1942, von Fuscher, in making his plans for heading to the concentration camps, had stated that he planned to take some of his former colleagues and students with him. Mengele was doubtlessly one of these, and it seems probable that von Fuscher had secured Josef's recall from the Eastern Front in mid-1942 for this explicit purpose. Consequently, in January 1943, after a brief hiatus in Poland, Mengele was back in Berlin at the Institute. But he would soon be sent to the place with which he has become synonymous, the concentration camp at Auschwitz in Poland. While all of this was proceeding, it was becoming increasingly clear to any German who took a somber look at the strategic situation that the war effort was doomed. Following the German defeat at Stalingrad, the Russians had gradually begun pushing the German armies back out of Russia. Moreover, in the spring of 1943, Britain, which was now joined by the United States following its entry into the war in December 1941, had defeated the combined Italian and German forces in North Africa. In the summer of 1943, a southern front was now opened in Europe against the Axis powers when the Western Allies commenced with Operation Husky and invaded the island of Sicily as a preliminary to encroaching onto the Italian mainland. Meanwhile, the Russians continued to press the Germans back into Ukraine and Poland, and in the summer of 1944, a Western Front was also opened with the D-Day landings in Normandy and France. The defeat of Nazi Germany by the Allies was now inevitable, but what was open to question was the speed at which the retreat of Germany would occur, and which of the Allied powers would arrive in Berlin first. On that might depend much about how high-ranking members of the regime would be prosecuted in the post-war settlement. In May 1943, Mengele, who by now had been promoted to the position of Hauptsturmführer, a captain, received his posting to Auschwitz. The Auschwitz camp had started in a small way shortly after Poland had been conquered. However, by 1943, it had been expanded into a vast complex under the direction of its commandant, Rudolf Höss. There were 3 camps. Auschwitz I was the original camp, and contained the administrative centers, the guards' quarters, and some of the earliest built detention facilities. Auschwitz II, or Auschwitz-Birkenau, was effectively an extermination or death camp. Here, Jews and other individuals who were sent here by the Nazi regime, including Roma gypsies and Soviet prisoners of war, were murdered en masse in shower rooms which were filled with the gas Zyklon B. The bodies were then quickly burned in crematoria, which were built on site. This factory of death was where over 1 million people, most of them Jewish, would be killed between 1942 and 1945. A final camp known as Auschwitz III, or Auschwitz-Monowitz, was used as a slave labor camp, increasingly for the purposes of producing a synthetic rubber manufactured by the IG Farben chemical company. It was to this vast complex that Mengele arrived to the early summer of 1943. When he arrived at Auschwitz, Mengele was appointed by Eduard Wirths, the chief medical officer of the entire camp, to the position of chief physician of the Romani family camp. His role in the wider camp was varied and brutal. The doctors at Auschwitz were central to what was called the selection. This was a process which occurred with new arrivals to the complex. When the trains of thousands of Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, Romani, and other unfortunates arrived at the camp, they were physically examined on the gangway, next to the train platforms. Little did the bewildered newcomers know, but the doctors appraising them were handing out death sentences to most of them. They selected a small number of those who were deemed physically fittest, and these were sent to the labor camps, while a few others were selected for reasons relating to experimental research or some other reason, but the remainder were all sent to the gas chambers and would be dead within hours. Mengele's detachment from any emotional response to this was strikingly clear. Some of the doctors at Auschwitz genuinely disliked being put on selection duty, a process which involved effectively condemning children and the elderly to death. By way of contrast, Mengele would sometimes show up to do it on his day off. Mengele was soon engaged in other activities which point towards a total lack of any emotional response to the suffering of others. This began almost immediately at the Romani family camp to which he was assigned upon first arriving there. Several weeks after he first reached Auschwitz, there was an outbreak of Noma within the Romani camp. This is an aggressive gangrenous process in which body tissue dies due to both the initial infection and a lack of blood supply which follows. It affects the mouth and lips in particular. A normal medical doctor's first concern would have been to treat his or her patients. However, Mengele's was to carry out experiments into a disease about which little was known at the time. Patients who exhibited symptoms were isolated in separate locations to be studied. Most appallingly, several children who had the condition were killed before their heads and organs were removed to be sent back to the SS Medical Institute in the Austrian city of Kudz for later study. This macabre research was still going on months later when the decision was taken to liquidate the entire Romani camp on the night of the 2nd of August 1944. There were other atrocities. The camps were riddled with diseases of all kinds, the result of poor sanitation generally, and the fact that those who arrived at Auschwitz were often carrying diseases already, a result of the cramped conditions of the trains which transported them to the death camp. As a result, diseases such as typhus and scarlet fever were often rampant. Mengele's approach to dealing with such outbreaks was viciously utilitarian. On one occasion of a typhus epidemic, he simply sent the entire populace of the barracks in which it had been detected, some 600 Jewish women, to the gas chamber. This barracks was then sterilized, before moving hundreds of new occupants in who were deloused and given new clothes on arrival. The process was repeated with each barracks. Perversely, for his actions in this regard in stamping out outbreaks of disease at Auschwitz, Mengele was awarded the War Merit Cross, and in 1944 was made the senior first physician of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And this was not an isolated incident. There are many reports of Mengele sending hundreds of people at one time to the gas chamber as a precautionary measure against the disease. He was particularly ruthless towards the Romani population of Auschwitz, but surely his most brutal action was in ordering the liquidation of thousands of Jewish people towards the end of 1944, when the camp's Russian supplies, which were a mere 700 calories a day for prisoners, could no longer be sustained. While Mengele's actions in combating disease and ordering other mass deaths at Auschwitz were brutal, He has become most notorious for the experiments he carried out at the camp. Mengele treated Auschwitz as a giant laboratory through which he could continue the research he had started back in the mid-1930s on heredity and genetics. In this regard, he treated the inmates of Auschwitz as research material, in much the same way as a chemist might treat the chemicals in his lab as something dispensable. He was particularly interested in people with dwarfism and heterochromia iridum, the latter being the condition whereby the individual has two different colored eyes. His methods were often brutal. One experiment involved injecting chemicals into the eyes of those with heterochromia iridum to see if he could change the color of the irises. Often after studying the subjects to the maximum degree to which he felt it was possible, he would have them killed, or killed them himself, with lethal injections so that their internal organs could be studied and their skeletons preserved for later research. Perhaps the most shocking experiments involved Mengele removing some subjects' organs without anesthesia. One man, who had one of his kidneys removed in this way, was quickly sent back to work without painkillers. Mengele is particularly notorious for his research into identical twins at Auschwitz, with whom he became obsessed for his study of heredity and other characteristics. Often when the selection of new arrivals was taking place on the gangway near the train station at the camp, Mengele was on the lookout for twins for his research. These were typically twin children who often arrived together, though there is evidence of a pair of twins who were nearly 70 years old being examined by Mengele. Exactly how many sets of twins he examined at Auschwitz is unclear, but alone during the summer of 1944, when 400,000 of Hungary's Jews were murdered en masse at Auschwitz, Mengele is said to have identified and examined at least 175 sets of twins. In a bizarre twist of circumstances, being a twin could actually initially be of benefit to an individual in surviving Auschwitz. Many who were selected in this fashion by Mengele would most likely have otherwise been sent straight to the gas chamber. While Mengele's twin subjects were also fed better than nearly all other inmates at the camps. Their heads were not shaved, and they were often permitted to keep their own clothing, rather than wearing the standard-issue uniforms, which were given to all others at Auschwitz. Mengele's research involved a large amount of taking measurements and other seemingly banal examinations of the twins. Witnesses later testified that Mengele was extremely detailed in this work. Exact measurement of the twins' skulls and other facial features were taken. One twin, who survived Auschwitz, later recalled Mengele measuring he and his twin brother's eyes for approximately 2 hours. Such examinations could occur 2 or 3 times a week for periods of months, and photographs were also taken. All of this seems to have been so that Mengele could record where physical variations, however minute, might have existed between identical and non-identical twins. But there was also a much more sinister aspect to all of this. Often Mengele would induce pain in one twin to see if it impacted on the other. Chemicals were used, and subjects were injected with random substances. Most brutally, Mengele's work on twins extended to studying their internal organs, and as such, he routinely murdered sets of twins, using injections of chloroform, and then dissected them. On one occasion, he suspected a set of Romani twins of having tuberculosis, so he simply killed them, and performed an autopsy to confirm his suspicion. Mengele had been wrong in his suspicions. The children did not have TB. What is most striking about all this was the simple manner in which Mengele completely dissociated himself psychologically from the act of killing. First-hand witnesses from Auschwitz, including Jewish doctors who were forced into acting as Mengele's lab assistants, reported afterwards that Mengele could be quite kind towards the twins he studied and other subjects of his research. He would often bring them sugar or treats and inquired how they were doing. Yet just minutes later, he could murder them as though it were nothing at all. Mengele was evidently so obsessed by his research that he believed it trumped any concerns of conventional morality, while his total indoctrination in Nazi ideology and the concept of Aryan racial hierarchy inculcated into him the idea that murder of supposedly less evolved races was completely acceptable if it could produce some scientific benefit for the Nazi regime. The result was terrifying. Here was a man who hummed Italian operas to himself while he dissected people he had murdered just minutes earlier for no reason other than a wish to study their organs. Consequently, it is no surprise to learn that Mengele became known in Auschwitz as the Angel of Death, in part because of his ubiquitous presence at the selection, and because of widespread knowledge of his experiments. Luckily, the experiments would soon come to an end, as the Russian advance on the Eastern Front into Poland had continued in the course of 1944. The SS had begun dismantling the concentration camps and destroying what evidence could be obliterated. By the early winter, moves were underway to abandon Auschwitz, and it would eventually be liberated by the advancing Soviet forces on the 27th of January 1945. Mengele was relatively late in leaving. On the 17th of January, he was transferred to the Auschwitz concentration camp in Lower Silesia. He took with him extensive samples from his research and his copious notes, but the bulk was left behind. His time at Auschwitz was not extensive, and by mid-February, he also had to leave there, again, narrowly missing the advancing Soviet armies. This was just the beginning of a continuous effort to elude the conquering enemy. For the next 3 months, Mengele moved even further westwards, trying to disguise his identity. By early May, he was in the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. It was here that he would have learned of Hitler's suicide in Berlin on the 30th of April 1945. And the collapse of the Third Reich in the days that followed. On the 8th of May, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the final surrender of Germany in Berlin, bringing the Second World War in Europe to an end. Mengele was a marked man once the war was over. The Allies had determined that they would not seek excessive retribution on Germany itself in the aftermath of the war, but it had been agreed that those who were at the top of the government would be prosecuted for war crimes, and in particular those who had been in the SS and had run the concentration camps would be charged for their crimes. Mengele would be among them. He knew he needed to stay ahead of those who wanted to apprehend him. On the night of the 8th of May, just hours after the war had officially ended, he crossed back into Germany, now making efforts to disguise his role as a member of the SS and posing as a rank-and-file German soldier. This continued for weeks. In mid-June, he narrowly avoided apprehension when some 10,000 German soldiers he had been amongst were detained together for questioning. But just days later, he was finally apprehended where his unit was arrested by an American division. What is striking about what happened next is that when Mengele was questioned, he gave his interviewers his real name, and it was even recorded as such by those who were questioning him. But for some reason, it was not realized at the time exactly who he was, that he was a high-ranking member of the SS, and that he was the notorious Angel of Death of Auschwitz, a fact which had been clearly recorded by this time. In April 1945, he had been added to a list of wanted high-profile war criminals. This was as close as Mengele would ever come to justice. For weeks he was transferred between detention centers, but eventually in September 1945 he was released. What seems to have won him his freedom was that he did not bear one of the blood group tattoos, which nearly all members of the SS were tattooed with. Mengele had refused this in 1938, when he had joined the paramilitary organization. That decision now brought about his freedom. He was dropped at the town of Ingolstadt in late September 1945, and from there, he headed to the city of Donauwörth. This was a time when Germans were still being stopped and questioned regularly by the American and other Allied troops, who were in every town and village in the country. So it was that he began to identify himself as Fritz Ullmann, in line with some documentation he had, which had previously belonged to a friend of his by that name. Later, he altered these slightly to read Fritz Hollmann. Another close call in Donauwörth led him to head for the Russian-occupied zone in eastern Germany. Here he finally managed to get word to his wife Irena that he was safe and was avoiding detection. Irena Mengele had already been questioned repeatedly as to her husband's whereabouts. This was the beginning of a long period in which Mengele continuously moved around Germany in the post-war period. His state of mind was not entirely level during this time. Bizarrely, a couple with whom he stayed for a while late in 1945 remembered him as stating that he intended to turn himself in once he could receive a fair trial, asserting that he had done everything he could to improve the situation at Auschwitz. Eventually, in the early winter of 1945, he found a job working as a farmhand in the foothills of the Alps, having returned to southern Germany. Here he worked for the Fischers under his alias of Fritz Hollmann. The Fischers soon began to suspect that their new lodger was a fugitive, not least as Mengele would speak about the Allies as the Crusaders who had invaded Germany, and his bitterness about the post-war settlement would often boil over in conversation. Soon he was back in contact with his wife, and in the course of the months that followed, she would visit him periodically in secret. And this is the life he led for several years as the Allies made episodic efforts to locate him. These were often half-hearted though. Without any record of his whereabouts or sightings, many assumed Mengele was dead already, in the same way that many other senior Nazi war criminals had simply vanished in the aftermath of the war. Eventually, in 1949, Mengele decided to leave Europe altogether. This was achieved using the so-called Rat Line, a network of individuals who were sympathetic to the Nazi cause, who used various methods to smuggle former Nazis who had remained in hiding out of Germany. Assisted by several individuals in this way, Mengele made his way over the German-Italian border in mid-April of 1949 and traveled to the city of Genoa in northwest Italy. Here he duplicitously acquired a passport from the Red Cross under the name of Helmut Gregor, and in the summer he sailed for South America. Here the Argentine government was particularly welcoming of former Nazis, a result of the acrimony between the regime there and the United States, while several other Latin American states also viewed aiding German war criminals as an act of defiance against the United States and its neo-imperial policies in Central and South America. Moreover, the Nazis had shipped massive amounts of money and material goods to Argentina in advance of the war ending, and it was these which bought many their relative freedom there after 1945. As a result, individuals such as Adolf Eichmann, one of the prime architects of the Holocaust, and Mengele were allowed to live in Argentina unmolested for a great many years. It was here in Buenos Aires that Mengele first settled late in 1949. Mengele's life in the years that followed was one of gradually establishing a new life in South America. For a time he worked as a traveling salesman, selling farm equipment, tools which he had grown familiar with on the Fischer's farm in southern Germany. After spending some time living with a Nazi sympathizer, he moved into an apartment of his own in Buenos Aires. Some family funds were channeled to him in Argentina from Germany, and it was enough for him to take a stake in a carpentry business and rent a house soon thereafter. It is also probable that he practiced medicine during these years, without an official medical license. There are records which suggest, for instance, that Mengele was involved in organizing illegal abortions. His family life changed too. Mengele's wife Irena, despite remaining faithful to him through the horrors of Auschwitz and the post-war period, was unwilling to leave Germany for South America. They divorced in 1954, and Mengele remarried 4 years later to Marta Mengele, his widowed sister-in-law, who had previously been married to his brother Karl, and who had joined him in South America. Such was the laxity of surveillance of Mengele that he was even able to briefly return to Europe during the mid-1950s to see his son, and he began living back in Argentina under his real name. The Josef Mengele was able to escape detection in plain sight during these years was largely owing to the fact that nobody was looking for him. The German authorities and the Allies had assumed he was dead by the late 1940s. This was despite coming to the attention of the authorities in Argentina. In 1958, he and several other doctors were questioned in relation to a network of medical professionals who had been performing illegal abortions, though Mengele was not charged. The episode produced enough worry, though, that he decided to change his location again, and in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he moved around South America on numerous occasions, at one time living in Paraguay and briefly residing in Bolivia as well. And this cautious approach led him to avoiding arrest again in the summer of 1960. In mid-May that year, the Israeli Secret Service agency Mossad raided the house of Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires. They had been tipped off as to Mengele's possible whereabouts and were preparing to seize him too. But Mengele was in Bolivia at the time. Eichmann was brought back to Israel, where he stood trial in the most dramatic prosecution of a Nazi war criminal since the Nuremberg trials of 1945 and 1946. He was found guilty and executed there in 1962. Despite the close call with being captured that Mengele had had in 1960, and despite the fact that it was now clear to international Nazi hunters such as Simon Wiesenthal that Mengele was in fact alive and living in South America, he returned briefly to West Germany shortly afterwards. Then he relocated to Brazil, where he resided on a farm near São Paulo, belonging to a Nazi sympathizer by the name of Wolfgang Gerhardt, while his second wife Marta settled for a time in Italy. These were the years in which Mengele was most actively being pursued, as Israeli agents and others sought his extradition from Latin America and tried to pin down his location. As such, it is not often possible to be sure where exactly Mengele was at any given time. At one point in 1962, Mossad had gathered intelligence that he was in Egypt. It is impossible to tell if this is accurate or not, though it continued to be South America, where Mengele largely hid with the aid of Nazi sympathizers such as Gerhardt and a couple of Hungarian expatriates by the name of Geza and Gita Stammer. These helped him acquire further hideouts around São Paulo and Brazil throughout the 1950s. Their aid extended to Mengele assuming Gerhardt's identity when the German headed back to Europe to receive medical care for a family member. Josef Mengele would elude justice for the remainder of his life. He eventually died on the 7th of February 1979 after years of poor health. He had already had a stroke in 1976 and was affected by other ailments, including high blood pressure. His death, when it came about, was owing to a second stroke while he was swimming at the seaside town of Bertioga in Brazil. The cause of his death is given as drowning. He had nearly reached his 70th year, making him one of the longest-lived of the more notorious Nazi war criminals. And 2 years earlier, his son Rolf had visited his father in São Paulo. He had not seen his father in over 20 years, and it was the first time he met him as an adult. His impressions of his father, as recorded much later, were of a man who, over 30 years after the war had ended, showed no remorse for anything he had done, but rather continued to affirm that he had done what he did at Auschwitz as part of his duties as an SS officer. Rolf Mengele concluded that his father was an unrepentant Nazi. There was one final twist to the story of his flight from justice. For many years the world was unaware of Mengele's death, and Nazi hunters such as Simon Wiesenthal continued to make efforts to locate the Angel of Auschwitz in the hopes that he would be brought to justice, however belatedly. It was not until 1985 when intelligence brought a cache of Mengele's correspondence to light in his hometown of Günzburg in Germany. that it was revealed that Mengele had died several years earlier. An investigation followed in Brazil to try to identify the place of his burial. These proved successful, and it was soon revealed that Mengele had been buried at Embu das Artes near São Paulo in Brazil, under the name of the man who had sheltered and aided him many years earlier, and whose name he had adopted, Wolfgang Gerhardt. Consequently, his body was exhumed in the summer of 1985, and an examination proved that it was highly likely that it was Mengele's skeleton, a fact which Rolf Mengele subsequently confirmed. It was never reburied. Today, the skeleton of the man who once killed people at Auschwitz simply so he could examine their organs is used as an educational aid at a medical school in the University of São Paulo. What should anyone say in evaluating a figure like Josef Mengele? As we have seen, this was a heinous individual, seemingly totally lacking in concern or empathy for those whom he experimented on and murdered, whether in the course of his experiments or as a cold effort to stop the spread of disease at Auschwitz. Perhaps it is worth assessing how he became the Angel of Death. Mengele did not become a member of the Nazi Party until 1937, and until the mid-1930s, he was a promising medical student who combined exploration of anthropology with examinations of human features. He was an affable character according to those who knew him, and scholars since have noted that his work from these early days is not problematic. It is not suffused with racism or violence towards others, but rather could have been read as legitimate scientific work of the interwar period. In this respect, Mengele, prior to his involvement with the Nazis, was somewhat akin to Albert Speer, the architect who later became German Minister of War Production. Before the rise of the Nazis and their involvement with them, both were middle-class academics with promising careers ahead of them. Neither had demonstrated any overt outward signs of anti-Semitism or the capacity for mass murder. Ultimately, though, after he became involved with the Nazis and began his work into racial anthropology under Professor Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer in Frankfurt at the beginning of 1937, Mengele's character changed quickly. By the end of 1938, he was not only a member of the Nazi Party, but also of the Waffen-SS, the most fanatical branch of the various Nazi paramilitary organizations. It was in this capacity that he enthusiastically joined the war effort, following the invasion of Poland in September 1939. And from the beginning, some of his work involved the concept of supposed racial purity. But the worst of it came at Auschwitz between the summer of 1943 and when he fled the camp in January 1945. Here, in a stretch of time spanning just 20 months, Mengele personally ordered the deaths of thousands of individuals, and in a great many instances, committed the act himself by lethally injecting the subjects of his experiments. These same experiments range from the immoral to the downright perverse, such as when Mengele sewed two people together in a bizarre test concerning conjoined twins. They died days later after their wounds turned gangrenous. Mengele was certainly a harbinger of death at Auschwitz during his time there. In the end, however, Josef Mengele escaped retribution. He spent over 30 years in hiding across a vast range of places and countries, sometimes returning to Europe and moving with seeming ease around Latin America. It is also striking how many people were willing to aid an individual who was guilty of the crimes Mengele had committed. He was also very lucky. In 1945, he was arrested by the Allies and let go on the basis that he did not have the standard blood group tattoo that nearly all SS members had. Then, he narrowly escaped arrest on several other occasions in the years and decades that followed, most notably in 1960, when Adolf Eichmann was arrested in Buenos Aires. As a result, Mengele escaped punishment in his own lifetime, but his crimes will never be forgotten. What do you think of Josef Mengele? Was he perhaps the most brutal of all the Nazis in his own way? And what explains his rapid change of character from 1937 onwards? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. This video is sponsored by Kamikoto Knives, the amazing Japanese steel kitchen knives that are honed using traditional techniques more than 800 years old to produce knives of supreme quality. Each knife comes in a beautiful ash presentation box, which makes the knives ideal as a gift. Our set comes with the inakiri vegetable knife, the slicing knife, and the utility knife, in a satin finish for all your cutting and slicing needs. They also come with a lifetime guarantee. Now you can own knives used by chefs at Michelin-starred restaurants. Their single bevel ensures the knives are razor-sharp, cutting through meat like butter. Plus, Kamikoto puts the same precision and quality into their customer care, invoking the spirit of omotenashi, or selfless hospitality, to ensure that their service to you is second to none. Even opening the box is a pleasure to see the flawless steel and know that you own a knife of professional quality that is expertly crafted, supremely well balanced as well as beautiful. And to cut with those knives was the best kitchen experience we have ever had. Kamikoto are currently having their holiday sale. And on top of that, they are offering our viewers an extra $50 off any purchase using the discount code PeopleProfiles on top of any of their special offers. So, click the link in the video description or go to kamikoto.com/peopleprofiles and use promo code PeopleProfiles to save $50 today.
If you find this video interesting and useful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with the latest videos.